Hello, and welcome to our online lecture for Psych 1101 and Psych 1010 at Lanier Technical College. My name is Michael Holman. I am a psychology instructor here at Lanier Tech, and I will be your narrator. Please note that these lectures are intended to assist you in better understanding the material, and should not be considered a substitute for attending lecture, reading the text, or completing your assignments. With that said, let's get started talking about personality. So this time around, we're going to describe the psychoanalytical perspective and how it contributed to the study of personality. We'll also explain the trait perspective and the Big Five trait model. We will identify the contributions of learning theory in understanding personality and describe the humanistic perspective on personality. We will describe the sociocultural perspective on personality and describe the different kinds of tests psychologists use to measure personality. So, true or false? Biting one's fingernails or smoking cigarettes as an adult is a sign of conflict experienced during early childhood. That is true. Bloodletting and vomiting were once recommended as ways of coping with depression. That is also true. 2,500 years ago, a Greek physician devised a way of looking at personality that, with a little tweaking, remains in use today. That is true. Actually, there are no basic personality traits. We are all conditioned by society to behave in certain ways. That is false. The most well-adjusted immigrants are those who abandon the language and customs of their country of origin and become like members of the dominant culture in their new host country. This is false. Psychologists can determine whether a person has told the truth on a personality test. This is true. There is a psychological test made up of ink blots, and test takers are asked to say what the blots look like to them. This is true. So let's get started. What is personality? Well, personality is the reasonably stable patterns of emotions, motives, and behavior that distinguish one person from another. Essentially, your personality is what makes you you. It's how you describe yourself. And we start in personality with the psychoanalytic perspective. This was started by Sigmund Freud, and he believed that personality is characterized by conflict. Conflict is first external and then internalized. So it starts out outside of yourself, and then you hold on to it inside yourself. Our behavior is the result of these inner conflicts. Freud said that there were three levels of awareness: conscious, preconscious, and unconscious. And our unconscious urges are kept below the surface by repression. So conscious is what you're currently aware of. Preconscious is anything that you can pull from your memory. And unconscious is anything you're not aware of. Psychoanalysis is a form of therapy used to explore your unconscious mind. Freud loved to describe our personalities using something called the human iceberg metaphor. And so he believed that what we see of the people around us was just the tip of the surface. So think of your consciousness as everything above water. Your preconscious is what's just below the surface of the water. Kind of like when you see someone swimming in a pool and you can see them below the water. If you wanted to, you could pull that person out of the pool and into the air, into consciousness. So that is your preconscious, just like memories. But the unconscious, down here, this is that part of your mind that is the deep parts of the ocean. We don't even see all the different animals and things that are floating around in the ocean in the deepest parts. These different figures here of ego, superego, and id, we're going to talk about in the next slide. But for now, know that most humans, we see their ego and we see their superego, but we very rarely see any part of their id. Their id is mostly in the unconscious. So Freud believed in those three psychic structures, known as your id, your ego, and your superego. Think of your id as the devil on your shoulder, telling you to do all the naughty things, all the bad things. Your id is that basic primal force inside of you that is encouraging you to go out there and do what you want immediately. The id is based off of the pleasure principle. It wants what it wants, and it wants it right now. So give it to them. That is the id. That's all it cares about. And it only cares about getting immediate pleasure. So it wants what it wants, it needs it right now, period. Skipping over ego to superego, think of your superego as the angel on your shoulder. This is your conscience. It is telling you this is what you should be doing, right? It's what makes you feel guilty about certain things. And it's also part of identification. So the superego is kind of the perfect version of yourself. And what happens is every time you do something that doesn't live up to the best version of yourself, your superego is there to wag its finger at you and to nag you and to tell you to do better. The ego is you. It is the guy in the middle. You're just trying to get through day by day. And the ego is based off of the reality principle. So while the id may want what it wants and the superego may want what it wants, the ego will try to make both of them happy, but working within the confines of reality itself. The ego is also responsible for protecting your mind from anything that might be considered negatively affecting it. And it does this using various defense mechanisms. There are defense mechanisms like repression, which Freud said was the ultimate defense mechanism. There's also something, say, reaction formation, where you believe that the feelings you have for someone are unacceptable, so you behave in the opposite way. If you've ever seen Helga Pataki from the show Hey Arnold, she was in love with Arnold, really, secretly, but she was his meanest bully in reality. That was because she felt her love was unacceptable. You might see regression, which is when you have a 30-year-old man that acts like he's 2 years old because he didn't get his way. That is regression. You might have projection, where you project how you feel about a situation onto other people. You accuse them of feeling that way. So if you have a spouse that is cheating on you, they might then accuse you of being the cheater. That sort of thing. So there's all sorts of defense mechanisms that we use to protect ourselves, to make ourselves feel better about situations or about the thoughts that we're having. Freud said that our personalities develop along 5 stages, and they are part of the psychosexual development stages. And these stages are the oral stage, the anal stage, the phallic stage, the latency stage, and the genital stage. And at any one of these stages, we can develop something called a fixation. This is expressed by a characteristic of that stage. And what that means is that some aspect of that stage is going to express itself in us as adults. And there are a number of fixations out there, things like oral fixation or anal fixation. Those are the 2 biggest ones that we'll be talking about today. So the first stage is the oral stage. This is when you're a very tiny little baby. And during this time, conflict centers on nature and the extent of oral gratification. So one of the big aspects of the psychosexual development stages is that you do everything, according to Freud, based on something called the libido, or the pleasure principle. You do it because you enjoy it. It makes you feel good. And that brings you pleasure. And that's actually why he calls it the psychosexual stages of development. He's actually not talking about sex itself. He's talking about psycho, as in psychology, as in the mind, and sexual as in pleasure. So mental pleasure development stages could be a way that you could better understand this. And during the oral stage, as babies, one thing babies are famous for doing is putting everything in their mouths. And that's why this stage is known as the oral stage. They are exploring the world around them through the only way they know how, which is by putting things in their mouth, and that brings them pleasure. But Freud warned that excessive or insufficient gratification can lead to fixation. So not doing enough as a baby or doing it too little can lead to being orally fixated. And this would manifest as an adult being really stressed out and then sucking their thumb, or having to smoke a cigarette, or having to bite their nails. Those are considered oral fixations. The anal stage is the second stage, and it focuses on the control of elimination of waste. So again, we're not talking about anal sex here. We're talking about the pleasure that a toddler gets from learning to control their bowels. When you think about it, they're learning to delay gratification. They're learning self-control for the first time, and this is really the first thing that a baby has control over in their entire lives. And so having this control gives them pleasure. But having too much or too little control can also lead to a fixation. This is known as an anal fixation. There are two types of anal fixations: anal expulsive and anal retentive. This all stems from when Freud noticed something that many babies can do. And if you have a younger sibling, or if you have children or grandchildren of your own, then you've seen this as well. And that is that most babies at some point tend to play with their poop. And when they're playing with their poop, Freud said that how mom and dad respond to them playing with their poop will in turn determine whether they develop a fixation or not. So let's say that mom is walking along and she sees the baby playing with her poop, and she immediately freaks out. She goes, "Oh, that's so nasty, that's so gross, that's so dirty, don't ever do that, it's filthy, filthy, filthy," right? Well, Freud said that happening too much can teach the child that more control is necessary, that they need more self-control. And so as an adult, they will be anal retentive. And this means that they have to control everything. They need everything to be in its place exactly as they have it. Their way is the right way, period. And in times of stress, if they can't control the situation, that makes everything worse. How they respond to stress is by trying to control the situation. But there's another fixation. So let's back up, reverse this, and let's say that mom is walking along and she finds the baby playing in the poop, and she goes, kids are kids, no big deal, right? Well, now the baby has learned the lesson that less control is better. So they won't have any control at all. And so they will develop the condition of anal expulsive. And what this means is that as an adult, they're going to be very messy, very disorganized, and in times of stress, they are just going to let everything go and allow themselves to just be messy in the moment instead of trying to control the situation. So those are two different types of fixations in the psychosexual stages of development. The next stage we want to talk about is the phallic stage. In the phallic stage, it is characterized by something known as the Oedipus or Electra complex. Oedipus for boys, Electra for girls, but it's the exact same complex either way. And this complex is resolved through identification with the same-sex parent. So what are we talking about? So if you're familiar at all with Greek mythology, then this will make more sense to you. The Oedipus story, the story of Oedipus, is called the tragedy of Oedipus. And so the story goes as an old Greek myth that long ago there was an old kingdom, and it was prophesied that when the prince was born, that he would one day rise up and kill the king. And the king said, "I'm not having that." So he had the baby executed. However, what he didn't know was that the queen secretly traded places another baby with the actual prince, and sent the prince to live with her friend across the sea who was in a neighboring country. And so Oedipus grew up believing he was the prince of one nation when he was really the prince of another nation. And it wasn't until the gods came down and informed him that he was the rightful heir to a different kingdom, and that that kingdom was currently being ruled by an evil tyrant, that he saw the light. And so he grabbed his sword, he grabbed his shield, he went on many adventures traveling back to his home country, and he comes up to a gatekeeper of this kingdom. It was the mighty Sphinx, the lion with the woman's head, and she gave him an impossible riddle. And he solved the riddle easily, and the Sphinx was so horrified that she threw herself off the ravine and died, allowing him to enter the kingdom and take over the kingdom entirely. He fought a great battle against the king, and he murdered the king, and then took the queen as his new bride. Only to discover, years later, after they'd had many children, that the king that he killed was his father, and the queen that he took as his new bride was actually his birth mother. That is the tragedy of Oedipus. So what does this have to do with this stage, right? Well, number one, we're talking about the phallic stage. And there is something that little boys and girls do often on the playground that freaks adults out, but really is benign. And that is the classic, show me yours, I'll show you mine, right? Little girls will raise their dresses and little boys will drop their pants in a heartbeat because they've started noticing differences between boys and girls, and they want to see what else is different. So that's why it's called the phallic stage, is that recognition that there are differences between boys and girls finally. And they also recognize this difference in their parents. And so little boys will become mama's boys, and they will become obsessed with their mom, and little girls will become daddy's girls and be obsessed with their dads, to the point where they're essentially in love with their parents. Not in a sexual way, but they are in love with them. And so these children will be in love with, say, mom, if it's a mama's boy, and they'll view their dad then as a rival for mom's attention. And so this is why you'll often see mama's boys run up and get in between mom and dad and, push dad away, right? Because they view dad as a rival for mom's affections. But what ends up happening is that at some point, mom's gonna choose dad in this weird love triangle, right? And so when she chooses dad in this love triangle, the kid realizes, oh, I lost. I can't get mom. Well, maybe if I can't get mom, it's because I'm not the right kind of person. Maybe the kind of person I need to be is the kind of person that got mom. And so instead of viewing dad as a rival, they will instead start behaving exactly like dad. So if dad's a police officer, now they want to be a police officer. If dad's a fireman, they want to be a police officer. They want to be a fireman. Any number of things like that. And it's the same for girls, but in the opposite gender perspective. So they'll do whatever mommy is doing. So that's how they resolve this strange complex, is through identifying with the person that used to be their rival. Now, they keep those feelings, though, and move into the latency stage. The latency stage is the easiest stage to remember because it's nothing. Nothing happens. You are just a kid, being a kid, doing a kid thing. This is from 6 or 8 to about 11 or 12 years old, just before puberty. So you're just a kid. There's no sexual things here. That's why it's the latent stage. All that stuff is still unconscious. It's not until puberty strikes and you find yourself in the genital stage that we have any more psychosexual developments. Because what happens now is all those romantic feelings that you had, especially for your mother, are now being mixed in with sexual feelings. And when this happens, you develop the incest taboo because you have sexual feelings now, but you already had that love for your mom. And so you're asking yourself, oh God, am I sexually attracted to my mother? The incest part there. And the way that you resolve this taboo is by telling yourself, oh wait, I'm not in love with my mother. I want to be in love with someone like my mother. And with the Electra complex, it becomes, I want to be in love with someone like my father. And that's why you will often see daddy's girls dating guys that are just like her dad. And mama's boys will often date girls just like their moms. This is also why, in a lot of relationships, the parents will not get along with the boyfriend or the girlfriend, because they're too similar. They recognize a lot of similarities in this new person, and the parents don't like it. So that was the 4 stages of the psychosexual development idea that Freud often came up with. But there are some other psychoanalytic theorists out there. Most of them were students of Freud as well. People like Carl Jung, who was the founder of analytical psychology. He downplayed the importance of that sexual instinct, and instead focused on things like the collective unconscious. So This is this psychic-y, mystical idea that says that all of us are psychically connected to each other, but we're not aware of it. We're unconscious of it. And so we all share that same headspace. And that ideas are floating around in the collective unconscious. Have you ever had an idea for a book or a TV show or a movie, but you never even said it out loud, you never told anybody, and then maybe a few months or a few years later, you see that idea or something very similar appearing on TV, and you're like, how did they know? Well, they didn't. But Jung would tell you that that idea was floating around in your collective unconscious, and it came to you, you did nothing with it, so it went to someone else, and they did something with it. Jung also believed in archetypes. Archetypes are specific personality types that people behave as. You might know someone that's the white knight, so they're always there to protect people and to rescue someone. You might know the damsel in distress who always feels like they need to be saved. Or the star-crossed lovers, this couple that is always fighting against the odds and something always seems to be happening to them, right? These are archetypes, just special ways that people might model their personalities after. And Jung believed that these ideas float around in the collective unconscious, and we unconsciously, unaware of ourselves, will latch onto these different concepts and mold our personalities after them. Alfred Adler was the father of individual psychology. He believed that people are motivated by an inferiority complex, meaning that they think that other people are better than them. But people also have a drive to be superior, and this leads to something known as the creative self. This means that because you feel that someone else is better than you, you then want to be better than them. You want to be superior to them. And because you want to be better than that person, you end up bettering yourself. But there's always somebody that's better than you at something. And so you constantly want to be better than them. Essentially, it's being so petty, but making pettiness work for you. Another psychoanalytic theorist is Karen Horney. Freud believed that girls felt inferior to boys, and many suffered from something known as penis envy, meaning that they were angry that they did not have a penis, and so that's why they went into more masculine fields or had positions of power. Karen Horney did not like this idea. It's a pretty sexist concept, and so instead she said that girls don't feel inferior to boys, but that social relationships are more important than unconscious sexual and aggressive impulses. Karen Horney said that girls didn't suffer from penis envy. They suffered from privilege envy, because men are the ones with all the power in the world still, for the large majority of the world. Men are the ones that are typically the presidents or the kings or anything of that nature. They're the ones who are the CEOs and in serious positions of power in universities and things like that. And so Karen said that women are frustrated with that. And so they have envy, but of men's privilege, not of their penis. Erik Erikson, you've hopefully recognized him. He is another student of Freud's, and he came up with the 8 stages of psychosocial development. And each stage is named for traits that should develop at each stage. For example, with adolescence, the goal is to obtain some form of ego identity. And we've talked about that in detail in a previous lecture. So let's evaluate this psychoanalytic perspective. Well, on the one hand, it did show a shift to examining problems as having some kind of psychological source. Before this, we were assuming everything was because of some abnormality in your brain structure. It also focused attention on childhood experiences. Freud very famously would ask people to tell him about their mother, right? Well, we focused on that for the first time and recognized that childhood experiences could affect you as an adult. However, there is no evidence for the existence of any psychic structures. So the collective unconscious, archetypes, the id, the ego, the superego, there's no evidence that any of that exists. In fact, there are serious problems with the clinical method Freud and his students used for gathering any of their evidence. The real problem here is that Freud came up with his ideas by monitoring his clients and then writing a book about it. That was it. There was no scientific observation. There was no doing research or studies or having peer review. He just came up with some ideas after meeting a few people and then published a book and became world famous. And now he's the most famous psychologist in the world. But he also, for every good theory that he had, like the psychodynamic theory or the psychosexual stages, he also had a theory like penis envy or castration anxiety. So the guy was not perfect. Moving on from Freud, we're now going to talk about some different ways of looking at your personality, and that includes the trait perspective. The trait perspective is all about traits. Traits are reasonably stable elements of personality that are inferred from behavior. So they're just adjectives that describe you. So if you describe yourself as funny, or loyal, or clever, or crazy, or anything like that, you're describing yourself using traits. The trait perspective goes all the way back to the BC era, when Hippocrates believed that your personality depended on the balance of 4 physical fluids or humors in the body. Things like phlegm and your bile, your blood. Disease, then, was reflected by an imbalance and was restored through bloodletting, so that's making you bleed, either with a knife or with leeches, and by making you vomit. And so he would say that you would feel better, you would feel less depressed after putting you in a vat of leeches. It wasn't until Gordon Allport came along in 1936 that we went from 4 traits to 18,000 human traits. Hans Eysenck was born out of this concept, and he came up with something called the trait theory. This focused on the relationship between introversion and extroversion, and stability and instability, or neuroticism, as we also call it. This is very similar to Hippocrates' 4 traits. So, Eysenck said that you can be either stable or unstable. Stable meaning very calm, unstable meaning the opposite of calm, very excitable. You can be introverted and you can be extroverted. Now there's one thing that I do want to mention. Most people, when they think of introverts, think of someone very shy, very quiet. That matches with what you see on the screen here. And they also think of extroverts as very outgoing, very sociable, very talkative, things like that. And that also matches with what's on the screen. But what you need to understand is that introversion and extroversion doesn't actually mean these things. It's actually a common misconception. This is actually referring to where you get your energy from. An introvert is someone that has a sort of internal battery. They need alone time to charge up that battery. But once the battery is fully charged, they can go out, they can party, they can go to concerts, they can be incredibly friendly. They also just don't need to be because they have an internal battery, and so they're just as likely to be unsociable or quiet or really shy. Extroverts, on the other hand, do not have an internal battery. Instead, they require other people. They have to get energy from others, from an external source, in order to keep themselves running and to keep themselves having energy to go throughout the day. I call them psychic vampires in this way because they need energy from others. I myself am an extrovert. I need to be around other people. If I go a whole weekend and I haven't seen a single soul except for the dog, then I'm going to have problems. I'm going to go outside. I'm going to talk to the janitor if I have to, just so I have some kind of human interaction with someone. So I need that energy. So that's really what introversion and extroversion is all about. Hans Eysenck's theory led to the major trait theory that we'll be focusing on, which is the Big Five theory, or the 5-factor model. It says that there are 5 basic personality factors: extroversion, neuroticism, remember that's how excitable you are, conscientiousness, agreeableness, and openness to new experience. Research has shown cross-cultural application and relationships to inborn temperament, meaning that these 5 factors seem to be applicable to people from all over the world. The 5-factor model is a very popular means of developing personality types. So if you've ever taken a silly BuzzFeed quiz trying to figure out what Pop-Tart you are, or what house in Hogwarts you belong in, whether the creators of those quizzes knew it or not, they're following the 5-factor model because they do exactly the same thing. They describe you. So let's evaluate the trait model. Well, personality tests have been used to identify different traits related to certain occupations. And these have been very useful for helping someone that doesn't know what career they want in their lives. But the problem is that trait theory is more descriptive than explanatory. It doesn't really tell us how someone developed this personality. It just helps you better describe what kind of personality you have. Positive psychology, when mixed with trait theory, believes that certain traits are virtuous traits. These are our character strengths and virtues. So things like being loyal, things like being friendly, like being honest. Those are virtuous traits. Okay, so that was the trait theory perspective. Now let's look at the learning theory perspectives. The first, of course, is behaviorism. Remember, behaviorists don't give a crap about your feelings. They only care about what you do. They only care about behavior. The big names in behaviorism, of course, are John B. Watson and B.F. Skinner. Watson believed that you should focus on determinants of observable behavior, not the unseen, undetectable, or unconscious forces. And B.F. Skinner emphasized the effects of reinforcements on behavior. So they said that your personality is simply based on the things you've been taught to do. The big criticism with this perspective is that it ignores the role of choice, or free will, and consciousness, because there are many times we might have been taught to do one thing and we did the exact opposite. Social cognitive theory was started by Albert Bandura, and it focuses on learning by observation and cognitive processes of personal differences. And it focuses on person and situational variables. So what this means is that every person has different things inside of them that are going to affect them, right? Your expectations, what values you have, how you learn, what you're good at, and how you control yourself. And that is going to interact with what you are rewarded and punished for. The situation that you're in. Think of it this way. I could have the exact same personal variables, the same personal values right now, but if I grew up in, say, London, as opposed to the United States, I would probably have a very different personality, simply because the situation in which I grew up was very different. Even on a smaller scale, someone could have the same personality, but whether they're in the city or in the country, they're going to behave very differently because their situation is so different. Social cognitive theory says that we can predict what you will do. We can predict your behavior based on what you expect the outcome to be and what your values about that outcome are going to be. And this leads to self-efficacy expectations, the belief that we can accomplish certain things. So because you believe that you can do something, you're more likely to do it. Observational learning says that our personality is developed from modeling or watching other people, or also known as cognitive learning, and that we acquire knowledge by observing others, and that includes our own personality. Social cognitive theory focuses on observational learning, reinforcements and punishment, but it also looks at gender schema theory. It says that children attempt to construct identities that are consistent with the appropriate gender script of whatever they believe their gender to be. So, and we see this a lot with people that identify as little boys or little girls, and they say that they will, if they identify as a girl, they're going to dress in, little girl dresses, or they're going to play with dolls or play house or anything like that, because that's what they've been taught is what a little girl should behave like. So let's evaluate the learning perspective. Well, on the one hand, it does emphasize observable behaviors which can be measured, so it is more scientific. But the problem is that the learning perspective doesn't care about your thoughts or your feelings, and so it avoids the inner human experience. Social cognitive theory also does not explain self-awareness or account for things like genetic variation. Okay, so the learning perspective was very harsh. It was very cold and just, I only care about what you're doing. We don't care about your thoughts or your feelings. The humanistic perspective is the exact opposite of that. Humanism argues that people are capable of free will, of self-fulfillment, and of ethical behavior. So you are capable of doing the right thing simply because you're human. We remember Maslow's hierarchy of needs, Now, we all have a conscious need for self-actualization, or being the best version of ourselves we can possibly be. We know that Carl Rogers believed in the self. This is your ongoing sense of who and what you are. Self-theory states that we should focus on the nature of the self and the conditions that allow this self to develop freely. Our self-concept is our impression of ourselves and our evaluations of what we're good at, or our adequacy. And how we evaluate ourselves is determined using our frames of reference. This is the way in which we look at ourselves and the world. We often will call this cognitive bias. So, you ever known anybody that just has a negative way of looking at the world, and that includes themselves? They're a real Debbie Downer in that regard. That's their frame of reference. So because they look at themselves in the world in a negative light, they tend to have a very poor self-concept of themselves. When talking about humanism, we have to talk about something known as unconditional positive regard. This is accepting a child as having intrinsic merit, as having worth, regardless of what they're doing. So even if they murdered someone, they still have worth. They still have value just because they're a human being. However, what we find instead is that most children are given conditional positive regard. This is when you accept a child only when they behave in a desired manner. Unconditional positive regard is what most parents say they have, that no matter what their kid does, they're going to love them no matter what. Conditional positive regard is what we tend to see them actually have. And let's face it, we're human. We tend to expect certain things, and if our children aren't measuring up, it would be very easy to reject them. The problem is that when we exhibit conditions of worth, when we create these conditions of worth thanks to having conditional positive regard, the child can develop a idea that they are only worth anything, that they are only a person of value if they meet that condition. So if your condition of worth is that you should have a small waist, then if they get fat, then they're no longer a person. If your condition is that you don't believe that homosexuality should be practiced, then if this child of yours tells you they're gay, they're going to believe that they aren't worth any value. So these are some real negative consequences that can occur as a result of these conditions of worth. Let's evaluate the humanistic perspective. Well, on the one hand, it does focus on conscious experiences. This is a good thing because personal experiences are very important to people. But the problem with this perspective is that personal experiences are private and subjective. So again, it's not very scientific. It also doesn't address development of traits and personality types. So it's addressing certain things, but not everything. The next perspective, when talking about personalities that we need to talk about, is the sociocultural perspective. Again, you'll either be from an individualist culture, or you'll be from a collectivist culture. Individualists define themselves in terms of personal identities and give priority to their personal goals. Most Americans do this. Collectivists define themselves in terms of groups to which they belong and give priority to their group's goals. When you come from a different background, you often will find yourself having to adapt to the new world that you live in. So whether this is moving from the country to the city, or moving from one country to the next, you have to adapt to living in this new environment. And this often is characterized by acculturation. So that's just what adapting is acculturation. There are certain patterns of adjustment that we see when someone is transitioning from one culture to the next. There can be complete assimilation, bicultural, or complete separation. Complete assimilation is when you have someone that completely gives up their old culture, whatever they originally came from, and completely embraces their new culture. Bicultural is when this person both holds on to their old home country's culture, but they also embrace their new culture. And then we have complete separation, where you're in this new region, but instead of embracing the new aspects of this community, you instead hold on with a death grip to your old culture. And so you hold on to all of your old values and refuse to adapt to this new situation. We have found that the highest self-esteem happens in those who do not surrender their culture. So bicultural people and complete separation people tend to have the highest self-esteem when in a new environment. So let's evaluate this perspective. Well, on the one hand, it deals with external forces that become internalized. Also really good. It also enhances our sensitivity to cultural differences and expectations. Up until this point, nobody's really addressed that you might be different because you come from a different cultural background. So that is a very good thing. So we have been talking a lot about different ways to look at your personality. Now let's talk about how we measure your personality. Well, remember that any good test needs to have both validity, meaning it measures what it says it's measuring, and reliability, meaning that it will reliably give us the same results each time. So in order to get this, we often will make sure tests are standardized. We use personality tests to assess psychological disorders, to predict the likelihood of adjusting well in work or school, and to measure aptitudes or your strengths. Objective tests are ones in which respondents are presented with standardized group of test items in the form of a questionnaire. Most often we will use a forced choice format, so true or false, pick from one of the following, anything like that. We don't want you to do a write-in. Students in Psychology 1101, pay attention to this. Your surveys should be in a forced choice format. You do not want someone writing an answer to your question and just going on and on for pages and pages and pages. Because how are you going to turn their answer into a graph? The answer is you're not. So for students in Psych 1101, make sure your surveys have a forced choice format or you're going to have a very difficult time later on. Okay, moving on. We want to talk about a specific test. The MMPI stands for the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. It is designed to diagnose psychological disorders and uses both validity scales to determine that the test is legit and clinical scales to figure out what disorder you might have. Here is a sample of an MMPI test profile. The red is how this client answered questions after treatment, but the blue is what their results were before treatment. So before treatment, we can see that most of their scales, subscales, are in the clinically significant range. That's anything above 65, or usually around 70. So let's take a look at the different clinical scales that you might can score on. There's hypochondriasis, concern with different body symptoms, depression, hysteria, psychopathic deviancy or a disregard for social standards like laws or norms, masculinity or femininity, paranoia, psychasthenia, which is just anxiety, schizophrenia or having strange thoughts, weird magical thinking, hypomania, being overactive or excited, being very impulsive, and the opposite, social introversion, being shy or inhibited. Now as you can see, they had quite a few scales like depression or psychopathic deviancy or masculinity and femininity or anxiety that were clinically significant before they got treatment. But after treatment, none of their scores were in the clinically significant range, which is just a great way to show that therapy really can work. Here is a real MMPI test profile, and these three are the validity scales, while these are the clinical scales. And as you can see, this person appears to be well within normal ranges, so they're not considered clinically significant or dangerous. Over here, we have three different scales. One of these scales has special questions built into the survey of the MMPI to determine whether you're lying. Another scale also determines if you're lying, but one of them will tell you, okay, this person is trying to make themselves look insane. And this one will tell me if the person is trying to make themselves look sane, so they're looking like they're not crazy, but they really are. And then we have a third scale that actually tells me if the person was just answering with random answers. They weren't taking the test seriously. This becomes important because it lets us know if a client is lying, and therefore if the rest of the results are worth anything of value. And this became very important the first time I ever gave out an MMPI. So I had a guy that was a coworker, and I asked him to take it. I said it's free, it's a personality test, and it'll let me learn quite a bit, right? So he takes it. I didn't think anything of it. He gives it back to me. I'm super excited. I'm grading it. And when I get done, I go, oh my gosh, this guy, his schizophrenia scale is off the charts. So I'm thinking, does this guy have schizophrenia for real? Like, should I try to get him to see a doctor? What's going on here? So I brought it to my professor, and I asked him, what's your advice? What should I do about this? And he looked at it, and he kind of laughed for a minute. And then he told me to look at the validity scales. And what do you know? The scale that tells me if he's just giving random answers was through the roof. So he was messing with me. He was just giving out random answers. So that is why the validity scales are so important, and it is how we can tell if you're lying on a personality test. There is another type of personality test that we can't tell that you're lying in, and that's because there are no clear specified answers. This is a projective test. What we will do is we will show you an image, and we will ask you to tell us the first thing that comes to your mind. That is a projective test. The first we'll talk about is the Rorschach ink blot test. You will have a response that reflects the shape of the ink blot. So what do you see? This is usually a sign of adequate reality testing. And the response integrates several features of the blot, which can show a sign of high intellectual functioning if you do. So here are some examples of real Rorschach ink blot tests. So these are real slides used when giving out this test. And so I would just show you this image and then ask you, what do you see? Here is another. What do you see? The answers that you might give me can give me great insight into what you could be dealing with or what you might be struggling with. And it's a great jumping off point in therapy. What do you see? What do you see? What do you see? What's cool about this one is some people will see bears, some people will see two gnomes playing patty cake, others will see a jet in the middle. This really is just like looking at clouds. Another type of projective test is the thematic apperception test. With this test, individuals are asked to make up stories about drawings that are open to various interpretations. These are widely used in research on motivation and to determine attitudes toward others. So what we will do is we will ask participants to tell us who are the people in this picture. What were they doing before the picture was taken? What are they going to do after the picture is taken? And what are they doing currently? And so here's another one. What's fun about this one is a lot of people will tell me that they might see that she walked in on him and there's another woman on the other side of the bed, or that she just killed him, or that she came home and he's drunk again, that sort of thing. What's interesting is that there are no wrong answers. There's no right answers either. It's just what you think. What do you see? And here's another. And that is it for the personality chapter. Please make sure that you are completing all of your assignments and turning them in by the due date. And I will see you next time for the next lecture.